Good evening, everyone. I'm Michael Creighton, a co-chair of the National Affairs Series Planning Committee. It is my honor to introduce our guest tonight. Chris Hansen has been a senior staff counsel for the National American Civil Liberties Union since 1984. And while he was lead counsel in the ACLU's challenge of patents on 2 human genes associated with breast and ovarian cancer that we'll hear about tonight, he has also acted as lead counsel in a wide variety of other landmark cases. These include the historic and successful challenge to federal internet content regulations, challenges to state censorship statutes in Georgia and New York, the reopening of Brown versus the Board of Education, and a major challenge to the foster care system in Kansas City, as well as many other suits across the country seeking to reform child welfare agencies. He received his law degree from University of Chicago Law School and holds an undergraduate degree from Carleton College. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Chris Hansen.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation to come and talk to you about a case that I think is actually very cool. I'm going to talk mostly for a while about this case involving patenting of human genes. Then we'll have a period of time for questions, and since I work at the ACLU, I'm happy to take questions on any of the kinds of things that the ACLU is interested in. So if you want to ask about other subject matter areas at the ACLU, I'm happy to talk about those as well. So, the patenting of human genes. Until recently, the ACLU had an employee who was a scientist. Her job was to identify cutting-edge issues of science and technology that raise civil liberties implications, and to try and figure out whether there was a proper role for the ACLU in dealing with those issues. So she came to me one day, and she said, "Do you know that they give out patents on human genes?" And I said, "Well, no, that can't be right. What you mean is they give out patents on the method by which you extract a human gene from the body." And she said, "No, I mean that there are patents on human genes themselves." And I said, "Well, that's wrong. Let's sue somebody." So we did. But to be fair, what happened is, at the time I said that, I knew nothing about patent law, and I knew nothing about genetics. But it seemed sort of self-evidently obvious to me that there was something wrong with the notion that you could patent a portion of the human body. And so we spent then 2 years investigating the subject of genetics and the subject of patent law to try and figure out whether my common sense reaction to the patenting of human genes was correct or not, and whether there was a role for the ACLU to play in the patenting of human genes. At the end of that 2-year process, we discovered that it was a very controversial issue. There were a lot of people who thought that you should be able to patent human genes. There were a lot of people that thought you shouldn't. But it was we thought ultimately that my common sense initial reaction turned out to be the correct one, and that you should not be able to patent human genes, and we decided to sue somebody. So the next question was, who are we going to sue? Who is it that's at fault here, and who is it that we can sue to challenge the patentability of human genes? We ultimately settled on a company called Myriad Genetics. Approximately 20% of the genes in your body are patented. Most of the people who own patents on your genes don't enforce their patents. They own the patent because they don't want anybody else to own the patent, and they want to make it available to the entire scientific community. And so they say, "I'll get the patent, but everybody can use it." Myriad Genetics is one of the 2 companies in the country that says, "We own the patents and nobody else can use it. Nobody else can look at our genes." And Myriad Genetics owns the patents on 2 genes known as BRCA1 and BRCA2. Those are genes, if you have certain mutations in those genes, you have an increased risk of breast or ovarian cancer. So we said to ourselves, first of all, Myriad Genetics is very aggressive in enforcing its patents. And second, their patents cover breast cancer genes. Everybody understands breast cancer. Everybody has been touched in some way by breast cancer. It is instantly understandable to say to people, these genes are correlated with an increased risk of breast or ovarian cancer. There were other genes we could have sued over. Most of them covered mutations that affected less well-known diseases. And frankly, it was one of the factors we used in deciding who to sue, that everybody would understand breast cancer. The other thing about Myriad Genetics is they vigorously enforce their patents. I said to you, most of the people who own gene patents don't enforce their patents. Myriad does. The patent Myriad owns on the breast cancer genes gives Myriad the authority to stop all research on those genes. It gives Myriad the authority to stop any scientist anywhere in the country from looking at the genes. Now, understand there is a complicated process by which a scientist extracts the gene from the body and looks at it. That is not part of Myriad's patents. People are engaged in looking at other genes in your body every day. Tens of thousands of people in this country can have the technology and the know-how to extract a gene from the human body, and they do it every day. The only genes they can't look at are these two genes because Myriad Genetics owns them. So the way it works is if you are a woman who has a familial history of breast or ovarian cancer, you will go to a genetic counselor. The genetic counselor will ordinarily then, if you have a familial history, will ordinarily recommend that you get tested. You give a sample of blood, and it gets sent off to Myriad Genetics in Salt Lake City. Myriad extracts the DNA from the blood sample and looks at the DNA to see whether you have the common mutations or not. If you do, they send you back a report saying you do, in fact, have a mutation that correlates with an increased risk of breast or ovarian cancer. Or they send you back a note saying you don't. Or they send you back a note saying you have some variants in your DNA, but we don't know what they correlate with, if anything, and we can't really give you any useful advice. For obvious reasons, that's an enormously important report for the women who have sought and obtained that report. And so you have a lot of really important and difficult decisions to make if you get the report back that says you have an increased risk. You have a mutation that correlates with an increased risk of breast or ovarian cancer. One of the consequences of the patents is you might want to have a second opinion to decide whether, in fact, you do have that mutation or not, because you're going to have to make some very difficult and complicated and powerful decisions. Well, Myriad Genetics won't let you get a second opinion. No other scientist in the country is allowed to look at Myriad's genes, and therefore you just have to take their word for whatever they tell you. In addition, Myriad gets to charge any amount it wants because no other scientist in the country can look at those genes. Myriad charges a very large amount. About half the women in the country, neither their insurance company nor public insurers pay for Myriad Genetics testing. And so there are a lot of women who can't get tested as a result of cost. That's a consequence of the patents. In addition to that, Myriad Genetics, because they're the only people that get to look at these two genes, know more about what these two genes are and what mutations do correlate with disease and what don't, and what to look for with these two genes. They know more than anybody else in the country. They will not share that information with the scientific community. And finally, because Myriad is the only place in the country where you can get tested, that test better be accurate. And in fact, we know for a fact that for periods of time it was not accurate. We know that there were periods of time when people would send samples off to Myriad and Myriad would not do a sufficiently adequate test. Myriad knew at the time it was not doing a sufficiently adequate test, and nevertheless they would send you back the results saying either you do or do not have a mutation when they knew that that information was inadequate or incomplete or in fact wrong. But because they had the monopoly granted to them by the patent system, that was the result you got back. So we sort of thought about all of these factors as we decided who to sue, and we decided to sue Myriad Genetics for all the reasons I've just described. We also sued the patent office. You know, at some level, it's not entirely fair to blame Myriad for getting a patent on human genes. The patent office is prepared to give out patents on human genes. And so at some level, Myriad's simply playing by the rules. And so we thought it was unfair to just sue Myriad. And so we sued the patent office as well. Okay, so we figured out what genes we're going to sue over. We figured out who the defendants are going to be. Now, what's our legal theory? You got to have a legal theory. You got to figure out why it is that this is legally improper. Well, we came up with essentially two legal theories. The first is that it's been a long-standing rule of patent law that you can't patent a product of nature or a law of nature or an abstract idea. So the theory is patents are about inventions. Patents are about has some human being invented something? Because if they have, we ought to create incentives to get people to invent things. We ought to create incentives for people to commercialize their inventions. That's the whole point of the patent system. But if it's a product of nature or a law of nature, you don't really need an incentive. Somebody's already invented it. Nature's already invented it. And so you can't patent, for example, gold. Gold is something that is found naturally. You can't patent gold. Everybody's said for years you can't patent gold. You can't patent E equals MC squared. It's an enormously important law of nature. It was an enormous amount of effort for Einstein to figure it out. It's an enormous scientific advance, but you can't get a patent on it because all he did was uncover a law of nature in the same way that you could uncover gravity. You just can't have a patent on it. So the issue then became, so the first legal theory we decided we would advance is a human gene a product of nature or is it a human invention? And so as we looked into it a little more closely, we discovered that Myriad actually will say to you, if the Myriad people were here tonight, they would say to you, well, we don't really have a patent on human genes. We have a patent on an isolated BRCA1 or an isolated BRCA2 gene. What they mean by isolated is extracted from the body. We took it out of the body. And Myriad says, once we took it out of the body, it is a different thing than it is inside the body. There are things you can do to it outside the body that you can't do it inside the body, the most obvious of which is you can look at it in more detail. We don't have a microscope that allows us to look inside the body and figure out what the genetic sequence is. But once we take it out of the body and put it in the bottom of a test tube and do some things to it, we can look at it and we can see whether you have a mutation or not. And so we've created something that is new and different. We said in response, oh, that's just ridiculous. I mean, just by extracting it from the body, you haven't created something new. You've just simply made something that already existed a little more visible. The analogy we kept using was gold, which I referred to a minute ago. You can't make jewelry out of gold while it's in the mountain. You can't look at the gold while it's in the mountain. You have to dig it out of the mountain. It takes a lot of effort to dig it out of the mountain. Sometimes it takes some effort to strip away the dirt. But it's still gold. Taking gold out of the mountain doesn't turn it into a new thing. Similarly, in our view, taking DNA out of the body doesn't turn it into a new thing. So that's been the dispute. Myriad is claiming it's not a product of nature because we've made it into something different by extracting it from the body, and we've argued it is a product of nature. We also made a First Amendment argument. It was a little bit this case was a little bit controversial within the ACLU. Nobody at the ACLU had ever done a patent case, and it was a very novel issue for all of us. And there were a lot of people at the ACLU who were skittish about it. So those of us who were pushing the case developed a First Amendment theory because the ACLU loves the First Amendment. That's the bread and butter of the ACLU. We are famous for protecting the First Amendment. We're famous for representing Nazis who want to speak under the First Amendment. All sorts of First Amendment things that some people find controversial. So I decided we would have to make up a First Amendment argument in order to defend the ACLU's role in challenging the patentability of human genes. So the argument goes, the purpose of patents is to advance science and technology. If I invent a new carburetor and I get a patent on my new carburetor, I have to publish the specifications so the entire world can see the specifications. No one else can build my carburetor, but the whole world can see how I built my carburetor. And the reason for that is because I can look at the specifications of the carburetor and say, actually, that was a pretty good carburetor, but if you put the screw on the other side, it's actually a better carburetor. And in the patent world, that's called inventing around. You can invent around somebody else's invention, and step by step, everybody builds a slightly better carburetor, and then a slightly better carburetor, and then a slightly better carburetor, and everybody sort of builds on everybody else's patents. Well, think about that in the context of human genes. How are you going to invent around a gene? How are you going to make a better gene? Particularly if your goal is to have a gene that you can use as a diagnostic. Remember, what Myriad does is it looks at the gene that it is isolated, it's extracted from the body, and is put in the bottom of their test tube. And they look to see if there's a mutation in the gene. And they don't write back to you and say, well, there's a mutation in the part of the DNA that we looked at in the test tube, but we have no idea what's going on in your body because the stuff in the test tube is very different than the stuff in the body. They don't say that. What they say is, because the stuff in the test tube is identical to the stuff in the body, we can tell you something about your body. They use the DNA they've extracted as a diagnostic. That means it has to be the same as it is in the body, otherwise the diagnosis part of this thing doesn't work. So how are you going to invent around Myriad's patents? The truth is you can't. So Myriad has not just invented a carburetor, a thing that you can invent around. Myriad has, in fact, gotten a patent that occupies an entire area of knowledge. Myriad has in its possession the right to exclude all others from gaining knowledge about these two genes. Well, that started to sound to us like a violation of the First Amendment. Can the government really give exclusive control over a body of knowledge to a private company? There are no case law to suggest that, but it seemed to us pretty clear that that was a fundamental violation of the First Amendment, and so we brought a First Amendment claim. There was some talk, mostly by me, about raising a slightly different First Amendment argument. I wanted to argue that the DNA was a speaker. What DNA does is it tells the body what to do. It tells the body to give you blue eyes or brown eyes. It tells the body to give you more of a particular chemical or less of a particular chemical. It seemed to me that the DNA giving out instructions was a form of speech. I have to tell you, I couldn't convince a single other ACLU lawyer that this was anything other than a crazy theory. And so we did not bring the theory that said that DNA is a speaker and entitled to the same free speech rights that speakers are entitled to. Although I still think it had some merit. Okay, so we've got the genes we're going to sue over. We've got our defendants. We've got Myriad in the Patent Office. We've got our legal theories, product of nature, law of nature, and the First Amendment. So now, who brings this lawsuit? Well, it turns out that almost in patent law, almost all disputes are between two companies, both of whom are trying to do something, and they're fighting about whether they can both do it or not. That's really the only model of patent law. We didn't have a company that was willing to start sequencing BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes, potentially risking getting sued by Myriad. And so we had to think of a different way to attack this problem. Well, what I do for a living is I bring lawsuits mostly against the government. And so I'm sort of accustomed to thinking in civil rights terms or civil liberties terms about how to put a case together. And so when you're putting a case together in the normal civil rights or civil liberties area, what you want to do is you want to get as many plaintiffs as you can, and you want to get as many sympathetic plaintiffs as you can. Because you want the judges who get the case to think to themselves, oh, A, gee, this case is really important, and B, this isn't just the crazy ACLU doing this case, there's some really serious people involved in this case who think this is a good case. So we spent a lot of time soliciting plaintiffs. We solicited 4 national organizations of physicians, clinicians, and researchers successfully, including the first named plaintiff, which is the Association for Molecular Pathology. The 4 national associations of physicians and researchers have a combined membership of 150,000 people across the country. We solicited 6 of the nation's leading geneticists, all of whom are engaged in genetic research and clinical practice involving genetics, and all of whom want to do BRCA1 and BRCA2 testing, but haven't done so because they're afraid of being sued by Myriad. We successfully solicited 2 genetic counselors. I told you earlier that if you're trying to decide whether to get tested or not, you go to a genetic counselor. Not all people should be tested for this. Most breast and ovarian cancer are not genetically based. Some is, so not everybody should go get tested. But you would normally go to a genetic counselor. So we solicited successfully 2 genetic counselors. And then we also have 6 individual women. All of this was very radical within the patent law world. Because as I said, in the patent law world, it's company versus company. And here we are bringing all these people in. And I will tell you that's the plaintiff set we put together. So we put this plaintiff set together. We filed the case in New York. Almost immediately, the patent bar blogs were abuzz with the way we had done this case, complaining that what we had done was so stupid and so offensive that we ought to be disbarred. That it was such a frivolous case that the punishment against those of us who brought this case should be disbarment. And they were particularly offended by the notion that we brought this case with women as plaintiffs. Now, we're talking about breast and ovarian cancer. These are women who are at risk of breast or ovarian cancer and who either can't afford to get tested or who want a second opinion. And the unanimous viewpoint of the patent bar was those women have nothing to do with the patents. They are legally irrelevant to the patents. It's outrageous to think about letting ordinary people involved in the decisions about what should be patented and what shouldn't be patented. We obviously felt differently. Okay, so we now have the plaintiffs. It's the groups I just described. We have the defendants. It's Myriad Genetics and the Patent Office. We have our legal theories. We file the case in the Southern District of New York, which is in Manhattan. It is for those of you who are interested in the sort of way lawyers make these kinds of decisions, the truth is we filed in the Southern District of New York in Manhattan mostly because that way I could walk to the courthouse instead of having to take an airplane. There were other factors, but that was at least a significant factor. It just was easier. We also wanted a court where we thought the judges were going to be smart and knowledgeable. We also wanted a court where the judges would not be overly dependent upon the biotech industry. We didn't want Southern California, for example. But part of it was let's just do something that's easy. When we did the internet censorship cases, we did it in Philadelphia in part because it was close by. Okay, so we file in the Southern District of New York. Now, one of the things you learn when you do the kind of litigation I do is that essentially all that matters, at least a large part of what matters at the first stage is what judge do you get. About half the judge, there are 30 or 40 judges in the Southern District of New York. About half of them I would have lost in front of. Another half of them I couldn't predict, and there were a handful that I could have won that I thought I could win in front of. And we got one of the judges we thought we could win in front of, and we did. We got a judge named Robert Sweet. Robert Sweet is in his 80s. He's been on the bench for something like 30 years. He is fearless. You know, he's been on the bench long enough that he mostly doesn't care what people think of him and whether people think he's right or wrong. And he is generally sympathetic to civil rights and civil liberties claims. We argued the case in front of him. He asked almost no questions, which is a bad sign when you're arguing a law case. You sort of want the judge to ask a lot of questions because it means the judge is wrestling with the issues in the case. But he asked almost no questions of either side, and so we hadn't much of an idea of what he was thinking. My favorite moment during an oral argument in the district court was the lawyer for Myriad Genetics said that he'd been thinking. A lot of what lawyers do is argue about metaphors. Or analogies? What is the analogy here? The gold analogy, for example, that we use. Myriad Genetics lawyer came in and said, well, here's the proper analogy. The proper analogy is this is like an egg, and deep down in the egg there's a tiny, tiny, tiny little thread, and what Myriad has done is this miraculous thing to pull that thread out of the egg and make it visible. And you can't overemphasize how difficult a task this is and how wonderful it is that Myriad has done it, and women are learning all sorts of things about breast cancer as a result. I got up on rebuttal and I said, well, I actually find that a very helpful metaphor, that what Myriad is doing is looking at something that's a piece of an egg. But I said I thought it was fairly obvious that this little string in the egg was a product of the chicken and not of the farmer. It's not a human invention, the piece of string in the egg. The egg is not a human invention. And the fact that you've broken the egg open and taken a piece of it out is not a human invention. The process by which you break the egg open, okay, maybe, but what you find inside the egg is not a human invention. So we argued the case in the United States District Court, and we won. Everyone in the patent world had predicted that we were going to lose. We probably would have lost before an awful lot of judges, but we won. The judge bought essentially the entire argument. He said, yes, that all of those 20 people, the organizations and the women and stuff, had the right to bring the lawsuit in the first place. And yes, these patents were invalid because genes were products of nature. And he focused heavily on the fact that the function of the gene, i.e. to convey information, was identical whether it was in the body or whether it was out of the body. Myriad, not surprisingly, Myriad appealed. Oh, he also dismissed the case against the Patent Office. He said, we don't really need the Patent Office in this case, and so I'm going to toss the Patent Office out, mostly because we don't need them. It doesn't really matter. The real fight's with Myriad, and so I'm going to let the Patent Office get kicked out of the case. So Myriad immediately appealed, as we knew they would. And you appeal patent cases to the United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit in Washington, which hears all patent cases and which is a notoriously pro-patent court. We then had a decision to make about whether to appeal the dismissal of the Patent Office. Remember, we'd sued the Patent Office because we didn't think it was fair that you let these only sue Myriad since they were playing by the rules. On the other hand, we knew there was some ambivalence within the government about the patenting of human genes. And if we appealed the dismissal of the Patent Office, we were sort of forcing the federal government to be against us. If we let it slide, if we let the Patent Office get dismissed, we had some hope that we could either keep the federal government neutral or do more and actually get the federal government on our side. We spent a lot of time making the decision not to appeal the Patent Office dismissal, and then we spent a lot of time after we just made that decision talking to people within the federal government, trying to persuade the federal government to flip, essentially, to be on our side. And we were successful. The federal government decided to come in and support our side of the case and argue that genes were not patentable subject matter. It was a very controversial decision within the Patent Office, within the federal government. And the fight, as we've been told, that the fight was, on the one hand, the Patent Office, which thought it had done the right thing, and the international trade representatives, which thought that the Patent Office had done the right thing, on the one hand. And on the other hand, it was the Council of Economic Advisors, interestingly, which was on our side, thought that these patents stifled economic development, and it was the medical profession within the federal government, NIH, the CDC, HHS, FDA, all of whom thought that this was that you should not allow patenting of human genes. That whole fight went on in the White House, we're told, and the federal government ultimately decided to flip its position and be on our side, with the Patent Office refusing to sign the federal government's brief. The Patent Office adheres to its view that it was right all along, but the United States, and it is a branch of the United States government, but the United States government is officially on our side. So we then argue the case in the Federal Circuit. The Federal Circuit reverses by a vote of 2-1. One of the judges buys essentially all of our arguments on the patentability of human genes, although he disagrees that he says 19 of our 20 clients had no right to bring this lawsuit because they don't have any business being involved in patent cases. But one of the clients does have the right to be involved, and so we'll let the case go forward. And if we're going to let the case go forward, I think it's correct that human genes are not patentable subject matter for exactly the reasons the plaintiffs say. The analogy he used was cutting a leaf off a tree. He said if you cut the leaf off of a tree, the leaf is still a product of nature. It's not a human invention, and that's really all that Myriad is doing here. One of the judges said we're just 100% wrong. He agreed that one of our clients could sue. He agreed that the other 19 clients shouldn't have been allowed to sue. But he said, of course it's a human invention. The reason, he said, is because in the process of extracting a gene from a full chromosome, a gene is a segment of a chromosome, in the process of doing it, in order to sever the point where the gene ends and the rest of the chromosome begins, you have to break a chemical covalent bond, and that's creating a new thing. Now, he raised this at oral argument. No one had ever used the phrase covalent bond, and the first question he asked me at oral argument was, but doesn't the extraction of human genes result in the breaking of a covalent bond? And you know, I had no idea what a covalent bond was. And so I stumbled. I said, well, and it doesn't matter. It's unimportant. Covalent bond. It doesn't. I know everything about covalent bonds. It doesn't really matter. I sort of bluffed for a minute or two. But I think I was bluffing correctly, actually, because I don't think it matters that it's a covalent bond. When you cut the leaf off the tree, you're breaking some sort of a bond. When you dig gold out of the dirt, you're breaking some sort of bond, and it doesn't seem to me that it makes the slightest bit of difference. But he was convinced that was incredibly important, and therefore it made it patentable. My favorite line of his opinion was, he said something along the lines of, well, biologists may think that genes are important because of their function, but chemists know that the function is completely irrelevant. All that matters about a gene is its structure, and the structure has been altered. Well, to me, the notion that the functionality of DNA is irrelevant is an extraordinary remark. I thought the whole point of DNA was its functionality, but he didn't. The third judge said, I agree that genes are patentable. Then she said, but if I were actually deciding this afresh, if I were deciding it without any history, I would probably find that genes are not patentable. The truth is they are products of nature. They're not structurally or functionally different than outside the body than they are inside the body. And therefore, if someone were to ask me afresh, are genes patentable, I'd say, no, they're not patentable. But we've been patenting them for the last 10 years, so I'm going to let it slide. As a result of that opinion, which I also find extraordinary, I've actually been saying that although it appears that we lost 2-1, I actually think we lost 1.51 to 1.49. We convinced her it was a product of nature. We just didn't convince her that mattered. And the federal government, as I said, came in on our side. The Solicitor General of the United States, who I gather was one of your speakers a year or two ago, Neil Katyal, came in and argued on behalf of the federal government that we were right. The Solicitor General never argues in courts of appeals. It was enormously unusual. He normally is the lawyer who argues for the government in the Supreme Court. So it was enormously unusual for him to come in, and we all thought it was going to make a big difference, and whether it did or not, who knows. So the next step is the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court does not have to take virtually any case, some, but very few cases is it required to take. So the process you engage in is you ask the Supreme Court to hear the case. The first decision the Supreme Court makes is whether they're going to decide to hear the case or not. If they decide to hear the case, then they set it down for full briefing and argument. Sometime this month, we're going to ask the United States Supreme Court to hear the case. If they agree to hear the case, then we're going to have a big fancy argument in the Supreme Court about the patentability of human genes. If they decide not to hear the case is over. I think we have a shot at getting the Supreme Court to hear the case, but who knows? We'll have to wait and see. The case, I have loved doing this case. First of all, I think we're right, and that always makes it satisfying to bring litigation when you think you're trying to accomplish something that's correct. And I think we're morally right. I think we're ethically right. I think in terms of advancing women's health, we're right. I think in terms of the law, we're right. But what has been most interesting to me is the fact that it forced me to learn a whole series of things I didn't know anything about. One of the virtues of a job like mine is, I spent 10 years doing mental health law, and I had to learn an enormous amount about psychiatry. I spent 10 years doing child welfare law, and I had to learn an enormous amount about child welfare rules. I spent close to 10 years doing internet censorship cases, and I had to learn about internet technology at a time when the internet was just coming into existence. And on this one, I got to learn about genetics and patent law, neither of which I knew anything about, and both of which turned out to be pretty interesting stuff. We'll see what the Supreme Court does. I never try and predict what the Supreme Court is going to do, but I hope they take it, because That would be fun to keep going. So that's essentially the story. I'm happy to take questions on either this case or on anything else that the ACLU does from anybody who wants to ask questions. See, you're all so convinced you don't have any questions. Yeah. I predicted at dinner the first question I was going to get was going to be either plants or animals.
Oh. I can't remember. I know like transgenics are patentable.
Yeah.
But what about native traits that are located? I'm just wondering how much you look into that same theory behind plants versus humans. I'm just wondering, human stuff is all natural. We're not doing any transgenics. But is native traits found in corn, are those patentable? Because if they are, then I can that's a really big crushing point between the two, humans and other things.
There are two answers to that. The short answer is I don't know the answer to your question. And the reason I don't know the answer to your question is that patent law with respect to plants is different than all other patent law. There's an entirely separate federal law that governs the patentability of plants. Okay, that said, the basic rule here is if a human being created it, it's patentable. If nature created it, it's not patentable. So that if you have a form of corn where you've gone in and a human being has altered the DNA of the corn in order to make it more resistant to something, then that form of corn is patentable. If all you have done is found a type of corn that no one else has found before, so you're the first person to identify this particular kind of corn and you want to patent that corn, no, you should not be able to patent that because that's not a human invention. All you've done is uncover something of nature. It's not always easy to draw the line between those two, but that's the general, that's how you would apply the rule to the plant world, or for that matter, to the animal world. It's no coincidence that we did this with respect to human genes rather than with respect to plant genes or animal genes, in part because the resonance of the inappropriateness of patenting human genes rings much more true for people with respect to human genes.
I have a question about the legal theory you didn't use, and I'm wondering why. I mean, in the Constitution, the patent clause says that the purpose of patents, or the purpose of intellectual property, is to promote progress. And it seems to me there's an argument, partly based on all of the plaintiffs you gathered, that patents in many areas simply don't promote progress, and indeed they impede research more than they aid it. So isn't that an argument that would be available?
Yeah, we did in fact make that argument. No one in the history of the nation has ever made that argument in challenging a patent. So, we've taken on an awful lot of novel arguments in this case. We did make that argument in this case. Even the district court judge who ruled for us said, well, that turns on a lot of disputed issues. Plaintiffs say that this is impeding the advance of science, the advance of women's health, the advance of research. Defendants say it is not impeding. In fact, it advances women's health, it advances research, it advances science. That is a factual issue that's very complicated and highly disputed, and I don't have to reach that question in order to get to an end result in this case, and so I'm not going to reach that question. If we had gone to trial, he might have had to reach that question, but he didn't, and since he didn't reach it, the Court of Appeals didn't reach it either. But that's a really hard argument to make, and in part because the one place where that argument has been made is in the copyright context. There's a famous case from a few years back. The the Congress changed copyright law. Both patent law and copyright law give you rights for a limited period of time. Mickey Mouse was about to come out from under copyright. So Disney went to Congress and said to Congress, you've got to extend copyright, make it a longer period of time, because otherwise we're going to lose our copyright on Mickey Mouse. And Congress did. Some lawyers went in and challenged that and said that you can't have copyright is intended to be temporary. You just can't keep extending it forever. And the Supreme Court said, well, we're going to let Congress basically do whatever it wants. And so the difficulty we had in making that argument was we'll just defer to Congress. Let Congress can make these kinds of decisions, not the courts. But we carefully considered that question. Surely the ACLU has done something controversial that's made somebody in the audience angry. Apparently not. Yeah. 20 years. Yeah.
And about the, let's say we're studying a virus or something that we haven't characterized before. Now that you're saying that that's a different thing from the human genome. For example, we have viruses. Well, for the Bar virus is associated with certain kinds of, bone situations. Does that mean we can't study that Bar virus and look at its DNA, or is this just unique to the human genome, where we're patenting just the human genes? And
as I say, the rule is it a product of nature or not? So if it is a virus that exists in nature and you are the scientist who have discovered it, you ordinarily cannot patent that. If it is a virus that you created by altering DNA, you can patent that. And if you own the patent, you can stop all research, you can stop all other scientists from looking at it in any way, shape, or form. Now, again, how you draw that line is not always easy, but that's the general rule. There are people who've tried to patent other pieces of the human body besides DNA. There are people who try to patent proteins, for example, that have been uncovered within the human body, making sort of the same argument. I've extracted the protein from the body, and because I've extracted from the body, it is no longer, it's more usable. I've created a function for that protein that didn't exist while it was in the body, and therefore it's patentable. So there are other pieces of the human body that people have tried to patent. But the rule is did a human being create it or did nature create it? We had one physician who had gotten a threatening letter from Myriad. The trial court said everybody had standing. The Court of Appeals, all three judges said only one of the clients had standing because he'd received a letter from Myriad saying, we understand you want to look at the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes. You can't. All of the other clients swore that they wanted to look at the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes. They swore that the only thing that was stopping them from looking at the genes was Myriad's threat of a lawsuit. The court agreed with both of those things and nevertheless said they didn't have standing. They didn't have a right to bring the lawsuit because they hadn't been personally threatened. It's an example of that which is contrary to the normal rules about who can bring a lawsuit. It's an extraordinary rule set up to make it harder to bring patent cases. The Federal Circuit was offended by the fact that we were trying a patent case as a civil rights case.
You're arguing that the patent prevented us from looking at the gene. I don't understand how a patent on the gene can prevent us from looking at it. Normally, patents don't prevent us from looking at a patented device. They prevent us from recreating it. So how does this claim constitute a claim against someone who wants to look at the place on the genome where this thing is?
Patents prohibit not just using, but possessing. And in order to look at the gene, you have to possess it. And therefore, you can't look at it. because you can't possess it.
But we possess it on our genome.
You don't we're back to the isolated point, which is you don't possess an isolated gene. And therefore, the minute you isolate the gene, you have possessed it, and the minute you've possessed it, you violated their patents. That's the argument. It doesn't make any sense to me, but that's the argument.
How do you intend to get over that argument then? I mean, from what I read the case, the court granted the patent on the complementary DNA, correct? All right, so in nature then, we go from pre-RNA to messenger RNA, and then it gets translated after the introns are excised, right?
All right, well, I can do, yes, I'll do cDNA if you want me to. So, for those of you who aren't geneticists, DNA consists of a long string of chemicals. There are 4 chemicals that make up DNA, and what is interesting about DNA is the order in which those chemicals occur. And they are represented by letters, so there's A, C, T, and G. And when you look at a string of DNA, what you get is a very long string of letters, and people are looking essentially for the typos. You're looking to see if there's a T where there's supposed to be an A. But that's the primary fight in the case is about DNA. But genes are a piece of the DNA, and when a gene is working, a part of the chromosome, the body extracts a part of the chromosome. But even still, the segment of the DNA that the body is extracting has something called exons, which are parts of the DNA that do things, and something called introns, which are parts of the DNA that we don't think do things, although we're not entirely sure. And so if the DNA is going to make a protein, which is what DNA does, it first has to extract the non-coding, the junk DNA. That piece, and then it sort of staples it back together. After the body has done all of those things, you have a string of DNA that is slightly different than the DNA in the cell because it has had the introns taken out. That's called cDNA. It's mostly done outside the body, not inside the body, and so there's a big fight in the case about whether cDNA is patentable. Whether DNA is patentable or not, is cDNA patentable, because most of the time the body doesn't create cDNA in the way I've just described. It's mostly done in the laboratory. I think cDNA is still patentable, is still not patentable subject matter, because cDNA does exist in the body, and it seems to me if the body makes it, then the fact that a scientist makes a duplicate of it doesn't make it patentable. But it's also the case that none of the patents that Myriad holds are limited to cDNA. All of the patents Myriad have claim both DNA and cDNA. And if either of those things is unpatentable, then the entire claim goes down. So at some level, the court doesn't need to reach the cDNA question. I'm not sure I was very clear about cDNA, but the bottom line is I don't think the court needs to reach the question of whether the DNA with the introns extracted is also patentable or is not also patentable. Yeah. Myriad owns the BRCA1 gene. You know.
How about if I cleave beyond that?
Well, no, then Myriad doesn't own it. But it's a very no. If you own, there was a big fight in the case about whole genome sequencing. So what is traditionally done is we extract a particular gene and look to see whether there's a mutation in that gene. Increasingly, it's becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to extract the entire DNA. And so there's a big fight in the case about whether whole genome sequencing, which extracts the BRCA1 gene and other genes, violates the patent or not. My view is that it does violate the patent. Myriad has been on both sides of that question. But the other thing about it is Myriad, you know, everybody in this room has a BRCA1 or a BRCA2 gene. But the odds are that we all have different BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes. That is, everybody has a slightly different string of these chemicals because some of us have mutations and some of us don't. Some of us have harmful mutations and some of us have non-harmful mutations, and we all have slightly different BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes. Myriad owns them all, regardless of how many differences there are. Myriad owns every possible variation of the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes that exists, those known and those unknown. They just own the gene. Nobody, neither the trial judge nor the Court of Appeals judges basically addressed the First Amendment question. You know, I've been talking about how novel it is that we brought actual women, for example, in as plaintiffs, or that we did other things in this case that were novel. The First Amendment argument is really novel, and the judges are frankly unwilling to wrestle with it unless they feel like they absolutely have to. I think it's fair to say that the district court judge thought it was novel and interesting, and the Court of Appeals judges thought it was novel and stupid. You only get national patents. Patent law is a nation-based entity. Myriad, however, has gotten patents in a lot of other countries. They have an EU patent over the BRCA1 and BRCA2 gene. They have a Canadian patent. They have an Australian patent. There are some countries, such as Brazil, that don't allow patenting of human genes. In all of the places where Myriad holds patents on the genes, there are controversies going on and efforts to try and stop them. My favorite is the Canadians. The Canadians granted a patent on the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes, and then their health service said, screw that, we're not going to pay any attention to that patent. And Myriad has been unwilling to sue them. So Myriad holds the patent in Canada but doesn't enforce it and just looks foolish. Coordination may be slightly more dignified than what we do, but we certainly talk to all those other groups. In support of our case, we had, for example, a Nobel Prize-winning geneticist from England submit a declaration on our side. We try to get international. We've tried to mobilize international as well as national support for the position we're taking. There's a treaty that governs intellectual property that tries to make all of the countries I've just described have same intellectual property laws, and so there's some advantage to us to try and do it in other jurisdictions as well. Way in the back. No, none. No, the industry has been universally hostile. We've gotten a lot of support from the medical community. The American Medical Association submitted a brief on our side, and lots of sort of the disease organizations, submitted briefs on our side, and the religious community has submitted briefs on our side, and the disease advocacy community has submitted briefs on our side. The biotech and drug communities have been universally opposed. I think it's funny because they all come up to me and say, gee, I wish you hadn't sued Myriad. They're really bad actors, but you're wrong. They're nervous. The biotech industry loves patents. It's their hope for making a lot of money is to get a patent, and so they don't want to do anything that would weaken patents. Yeah.
As a hypothetical, then they own every variant of both BRCA1 and 2. Someone develops breast cancer. Are they? What's a fair use then of the patent? Since they're expressing the protein. Since they'd be expressing the protein, they're clearly using the gene.
Yes, although Myriad would say to you they're using the gene, but they're not using the isolated gene, and therefore they haven't infringed on the patent. The The whole case turns on Myriad's view that outside the body is different than inside the body. And so a woman they don't say that the gene is that's sitting in your body right now that they own, and they don't say that the gene is that's acting inside your body right now is infringing. But if you took the gene out of the body, and if you gave it to a lab rat, and the lab rat developed breast cancer, then they would say that you violated their patent.
So there's some arbitrary distinction here that it doesn't necessarily have to come out of the body. If you can put it in a body to express it.
You have to take it out in order to put it in. And once you've taken it out, you've violated their patent.
But I read the case. They were arguing that the isolate is simply a product of removing the introns.
No. Isolated human gene includes the human gene with the introns in it. They have got a patent on DNA with both exons and introns included, and DNA with the introns excluded. Both. They own both things as part of their patents.
I have a question that comes around a different side. I mean, there are genetic markers, and there's a new industry looking for genetic markers that identify things like breast cancer. Mm-hmm. And we do want to incentivize that research.
Absolutely.
And the purpose of patents is to incentivize research.
Absolutely.
Is there a way to incentivize research other than patent? Is there an alternate institution that you would recommend to accomplish that?
Yeah, it's scientific advancement. I mean, what we know, let's take this example. When Myriad was the reason Myriad owns the patent is because they were the first to identify the gene. They were first to identify where in your DNA this particular gene is found. They were first by about a week. There were 4 other labs all over the world looking for the gene. All the other labs had already announced, so they had already announced that they either would patent the gene and make it available to the entire world, or they would not patent the gene. So we already know that scientists, even without the incentive of the patent system, would have found this gene. We also know from the fact that there are tens of thousands of people doing genetic testing every day, and from the importance of breast cancer, that if one of those other labs had found the gene, there would be people testing to see whether women had an increased risk of breast or ovarian cancer. So that we know that for the example here, we did not need the patent system to incentivize either the research or the commercialization of the research. And that we think, and there's an economic theory underlying this, that we think is true of all basic research. That in fact, patenting basic research, patenting products of nature and laws of nature, has a drag on increasing scientific advancement, has a drag in incentivizing scientific advancement rather than helping it. Well, the short answer is nobody knows the answer to that question. What has happened over the last few years is the Patent Office has increasingly ignored the rules about where you should stop patenting things. My favorite example is the Patent Office has granted a patent on a method of dating. Not carbon dating, but boy meets girl dating. Now, I've never actually read that patent, but I have the fantasy that it says, step 1, walk into a bar. Step 2, sit down next to someone who's attractive. Step 3, ask them their sign. Step 4, the Patent Office has granted a method of swinging a golf club. I mean, the Patent Office has decided that essentially everything in the world is patentable. And we're gradually, this case and a couple of others, are gradually starting to chip away at that. And what the effect would be of chipping away of all that, we don't really know for sure. I think it would mean fewer things get patented. I think that would be a good thing, not a bad thing.
All right, well, thanks again to Chris Hansen for being here and speaking tonight.
Thank you.
And if you could all join me in giving and thanking him again. And we'd like to remind everyone that there's a reception in the back, and you can have time to ask more questions with him then. Thank you.